first of all, a good evening and happy Friday, everyone, wherever you're joining from in the UK or maybe around the world, if you're lucky enough to be on holiday. Thanks for joining. So we've got a 20-minute presentation as part of this LGCC sort of info night. This is a bit of a new event for the club, and it's something that Agris has kindly agreed to allow me to present to you. So a quick introduction. So about me, my name's Tom Helleman. I'm an Australian expat working in pro road cycling. I work for Team Bahrain Victorious. I've been with the team for 2 years, living in the UK. Before that, I used to work with other male and female pro cyclists in Spain and also back in Australia. Some of the athletes that I've worked with have actually competed in races like Dirty Kanza, the CX Cyclocross World Championships. So gravel is popular even amongst the dyed-in-the-wool road cyclist athletes. I'm also a bike rider and enjoy the gravel riding that the UK has to offer, and really enjoy being part of the LGCC community. So with no further ado, let's get into it. A brief outline of what we're going to talk about in today's presentation. So to begin, we're going to just look at the demands of gravel racing. So I'm sure we're going to have a range of people that have participated in maybe some gravel events in the past, maybe some mountain bike races, maybe some road races. But I really want to break it down and see what gravel racing as a discipline demands of us as athletes. And we'll talk about some of the differences between mountain biking and road cycling. And using that sort of knowledge that we then have about how the disciplines are different and what the demands are, we'll talk about some ways that you can adjust the training that you do. And training sounds like a scary word, but for us, it's just the riding that we do on a regular basis, how we can make some little tweaks to that riding to improve our performance in gravel events. I'll give you some practical strategies that you can put into practice in your training. So a couple of little session examples and some recommendations as to how you can switch up your riding a little bit to get more out of it when it comes to race day. Finally, we'll have some time for questions at the end. So as I said before, feel free to put any questions you have in the chat, and I will get to as many of those as I can at the end of the session. And just a quick reminder, if everyone could just kindly mute their microphones so we don't have any interference during the presentation. Cool. So before we get stuck in, I'm aware that we've got a range of people here and everyone's got a slightly different background, and whether people train with power meters or heart rate monitors or nothing at all. So I just wanted to run through a couple of words that we're going to be using, some terminology in this presentation to make sure everyone's on the same page. We'll try and keep it pretty simple, but basically these are the key ones that will come up in today's presentation. So I'd just like to mention intensity first. So that's when we're talking about how hard we're working, and later on in the session you'll see some ratings of perceived exertion, RPE. I've put the scale on the slide here. So that's a 1 to 10 scale that we'll use to refer to how hard you're going to be working at any given point. Some people have used a different scale. 1 to 10 is very simple, and we'll stick with that one for today. And if you have a power meter or a heart rate monitor, you can adjust that 7 out of 10 to your particular metrics, whether that's your power threshold or your heart rate threshold. And remember to keep in context the rating relative to the effort that you're making. So if a 10 out of 10 is a maximum sprint, then how do we describe a maximum effort up a hill that takes 10 minutes, because we can't sprint full gas for 10 minutes. So it has to be in context. The next one, cadence. So that's quite simply just the speed that you're pedaling, so your revolutions per minute. Some people have monitors for that. You can count it over a few seconds if you want to get an idea if you don't have a cadence meter. Torque. So this one, to put simply, is how hard we're pushing on the pedals. So imagine just the force that your foot is putting down on the pedals. We're going to be talking about how this concept, we can manipulate the torque, that how hard we're pushing on the pedals in our training to help us improve our performance in gravel racing. Interval training, everyone's favorite hobby. The idea with interval training is to separate periods of more intense exercise, work, and easier periods, so recovery. And the idea there is that we can fit more work at a specific intensity into a session. And this one, the last one, specificity, a really fun one to try and say. So what we're talking about there is how a particular effort or training practice can target a particular event. So for example, if you were training for an event where you knew the terrain had a lot of sand and soft ground, you might consider riding in places that had some similar terrain, so that the type of training that you're doing is specific to your target event. Any questions on those, please pop them in the chat. But for now, we'll just carry on. So one of the things that's great about gravel cycling, in my view, is the diversity. And I think that it's fantastic that we have this new kind of discipline that doesn't have rules or tradition. Anyone can participate on a range of bikes, and you can pretty much do it anywhere. So as you can see on this little infographic here, gravel covers a lot of the spectrum of terrain and the nature of racing, right across from road to mountain bike. So if you have a look at the pictures that I've just popped up there, so the one on the left hand side, you can see he's a professional road cyclist, that guy, on an aerodynamic road bike with some pretty skinny tires, but he's riding in a gravel race. And then on the other side, on the right there, you've got an athlete that's on a bike with flat bars. Some people might call that a mountain bike. And you can see the terrain in the background is quite steep and quite challenging, and there's people actually walking down that section on their drop bar bikes. So that's sort of at the more technical end. So you can see that gravel is really diverse in terms of the terrain that you're potentially taking on. And that's one of the things that's great. You can find events that really kind of replicate the type of riding that you do locally, or you can take on something that's completely different, more or less on the same bike. Okay, moving on. So as I mentioned in the outline, we're just going to talk about some of the demands of gravel racing as a sport. So the format is typically a mass start event. So all the riders starting together, and typically it's quite fast at the beginning. And this is due to the nature of the course, often sort of getting narrower, or the road becoming rougher as you leave the start area. So that high speed at the beginning demands a high level of effort and intensity from the athletes at the beginning to secure a good position in the group. The races can be very long, so I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the Dirty Kanza, or Unbound Gravel as it's now known, and that's a 200-mile gravel race in the US, done at a reasonable altitude, making it even tougher. But that takes people literally from sunrise, and sometimes they finish at nighttime. So the endurance demands of these type of events are quite extreme. On the flip side, you have some races which are more like a couple of hours, which are raced at a much faster pace, higher intensity. As I mentioned in the previous slide, there's a really broad range of terrain that you can encounter in gravel racing, because it is such a new sport as well. With that range of terrain, you're going to have sections where you might be riding a single track, which is a narrow trail, like a mountain bike trail in some cases, which is a bit more technically demanding. Riders are riding single file, and that's one element. And then on the flip side, you might be on a very smooth gravel road. Some races will have tarmac sections as well, where you might be taking on a section of 10 kilometers on a tarmac road between gravel sections, and the riders will organize themselves into a peloton, into a group, and you'll have to draft, so sit behind other people to to take advantage of the reduced resistance when you're riding behind another rider. There's also a tactical element. So I mentioned that there's a fast start. I mentioned that the course changes a lot. So one of the things we need to think about is what our goals are for the event. If we're racing to finish for the first time, if it's a really long event, we need to be thinking about how we use our energy. So something like Dirty Kanza, which if you're finishing in 15 hours, you probably don't want to be sprinting off the front line of the grid with the guys that want to win it, because chances are 7 hours into that, you might be feeling a little bit regretful about using so much of your energy so early on. So the tactical element is just something to think about with regards to what your goals are for the event and the format of the event. The next point, self-sufficiency. So we know anyone who's been out riding their bike in the woods knows that sometimes things happen. We get punctures, we drop our energy bar, our phone doesn't have any signal. So there's an element of self-sufficiency required as a gravel racer. And that means that you need to be able to get yourself through any sort of technical issues, or physical issues. So, dealing with heat, dealing with crashes, anything that pops up along the way. That's definitely a challenge. That's, we've all heard stories of at the end of a race when everyone's chatting about the way that they got a flat tire or their bike got damaged or something like that happened. Chances are that the unpredictable will happen in a gravel race. So that's something to keep in mind as well, and always be prepared for the unexpected. So we're going to talk quickly about ways we can tweak our training, our regular riding, to improve our performance in gravel races. We mentioned torque before, so how hard we're pushing on the pedals. When we're riding on gravel or soft terrain compared to on smooth terrain or riding the road bike, there's a lot higher resistance. And typically that means that we're going to be pedaling at a slightly lower cadence. So the speed of our legs, the RPM, is going to be a little bit lower. And sometimes in situations like in this picture on the slide there, we get to a really steep hill and we're in our absolute lowest gear. So we've run out of gears, we can't go into an easier gear, and we really just have to push really hard on the pedals to get up over this steep climb. So one thing that we can incorporate into our training is to practice some high torque pedaling. And the way we do that is by training at a lower cadence. So we can do some interval training at a lower cadence. I've got an example of that in one of the slides that follows. The next term I've got there, so front-ended intervals. And what I mean by that is when we talked about the gravel races starting off fast, so we're talking about doing an interval or doing a workout that has an effort that's quite intense in the beginning, and then subsides a little bit, but you maintain a level of effort. So a bit like the format of a race, where you would start off quite quickly, the first few minutes are quite fast, and then things tend to settle down a little bit. So practicing that type of effort in training is going to set you up well for sticking with the group when the race begins. So the next point there, using that tricky word, specificity. So gravel is really so diverse in terms of the terrain. I'm sure the people on this call can think of places in the UK where they ride, where they're riding over, whether it's sticky mud, whether it's sand, whether it's loose rock, flat or hilly. There's a massive range, and the key there is to know your event and have a think about what the type of challenges that you'll face in that event are going to look like, and how you can try and tailor your riding to give you more practice at that type of terrain or conditions, because the weather can be another thing that impacts things drastically. So if you're racing at a time of the year that's prone to some wetter conditions, then it's probably a useful practice session to go out when the weather is wet and see how your bike responds to that sort of riding, and make sure you've got the appropriate clothing and so forth. My next point there, so fueling, due to the length of gravel races, it's something that we just have to talk about briefly, because our capacity to keep riding for hour after hour and do these ultra endurance events, these 100-mile races and similar distances, requires a lot of fuel to be taken on during the event. You can't possibly eat enough pasta the night before to get through. We're not going to go too deep into nutrition, but I just wanted to add that there as something to think about. If you're going out for a ride of anything more than an hour and a half, you want to practice taking some food with you as you would eat during a race, and eating that on your training ride, and getting in the habit of being able to eat and digest food as you're training. Next up, we're just going to touch on a couple of points. This is just kind of my acknowledgement of a lot of people have come into gravel riding from a background of being a road rider or a mountain biker. And of course, some people this is their first step into cycling or competitive cycling. But for those of us that really sort of predominantly do a particular type of riding, there's a couple of points here how we can tailor our riding to improve our performance in gravel races. So starting off with the mountain bikers here, one of the difference between, I mentioned mountain bike cross-country events earlier, the differences between that type of race and a gravel race. The mountain bike events tend to be very on and off. So you're either working really hard for a short period on a climb, or you're sort of coasting on a descent. Because of the terrain is quite steep and quite technical. Gravel races are not quite as up and down, as on and off as mountain bike races, cross-country races. So one of the things that mountain bikers can do to adapt their riding is to start to do some longer, more sustained rides. It's typical when you're mountain biking to stop every couple of trails and take a drink of water or something like that. But if you're training for a 3-hour gravel race, you're probably not going to stop quite as much. So it can be a handy technique to just practice pushing through. The next point there, so riding in a group and actually drafting others, as we alluded to before, that's going to be important when you're in one of these mass start gravel races and you've got a smooth road section or perhaps a tarmac section. You can really save some energy by riding with other people. So if you're unfamiliar with that, then practicing that by riding with others on the road, that's a really easy way to get into it. But you can do it sort of on smooth gravel or fire trails as well. But just practicing riding in and around other people so that you're comfortable with that is going to be really valuable come race day. Taking your gravel bike to mountain bike trails and just getting used to how the bike responds compared to your bike with suspension and bigger tires and so on, I think is really valuable as well. And for the road riders, so we mentioned the sort of higher torque pedaling on a couple of on an earlier slide. For road riders, typically they spin a higher cadence or higher speed of pedaling. If you want to adjust for gravel racing, trying to ride a lower cadence, perhaps on the climbs when there's a little bit more resistance, is a way that you can sort of more closely replicate the type of effort that your muscles are going to be put under during a gravel race. And sort of in contrast to the mountain bikers, they're going to want to practice on those, that loose terrain, rough and soft ground, because your bike will respond quite differently to riding on a tarmac road. And on that note, that sort of rough terrain provides a bit of a vibration up through the bike that can leave people feeling quite shaken, quite sore. Wrists, lower back, this kind of these areas of the body take a bit of a beating when you're riding essentially a bike with no suspension over bumpy ground like in a gravel race. So it's worth considering doing some, if you're a pure road cyclist, if this is a new sort of event to you, it's worth doing some strength and conditioning, S&C, work in the gym. You can speak to a coach for that or get some advice from other athletes or trainers in that area that will help you. And then the corollary to the mountain bike side, so riding your gravel bike on the road gives you that extra resistance, and that will help again make your riding more specific to improving your performance on gravel. A couple of little sessions that I just wanted to put out there for people to perhaps have a crack at with the things that they've learned from this session. So the first ones are torque sessions. We mentioned that high torque pedaling. If you find yourself a steep climb, it can be on the road or the mountain bike. The UK, we don't have massive alpine passes, but a short climb of a couple of minutes will be plenty. So you can also do it into a headwind or on soft ground like sand if that's more practical for where you live. But so ideally in a 1 to 3 minute duration, bottom to top, and then you can climb a range of repeats depending on whether you're just starting to train or whether you're very close to race fitness. But sort of I've put a range of 4 to 10 there. And going back to that intensity chart we had before, so about an 8 out of 10. So remember 10 being as hard as you could go for that 1 to 3 minute period. You want to dial that back to about an 8 out of 10. And a cadence of 60 RPM, so that's a bit lower than we'd normally ride. Think if you don't have a cadence monitor on your bike, that's 1 revolution per second. So you can sort of just count that in time with your pedaling, 1 revolution per second. Pretty straightforward there. And then with recovery, so these are repeats. We need to have some off or some recovery period between the efforts. If your climb is 1 minute, then we want to recover for 3 times that, so 3 minutes between. Just keep that 3 to 1 ratio to enable you to keep putting out that 8 out of 10 effort on the climbs. We mentioned for the mountain bikers, it's advantageous to do some sustained power efforts. So these are going to be longer intervals at a lower intensity, but one where it's still, you can feel you're working. It's going to be a little bit harder to maintain a conversation. You can sort of only speak in short bursts, if you like. So about a 6 or a 7 out of 10 on the scale there, but we can sustain these ones for a lot longer. So you might start off trying some at 15 minutes, and then as you approach your events, you might extend those. And the professionals will often do these kind of efforts for 60 or 70 minutes in their training. When we're doing these sort of steady state sustained efforts, one thing to keep in mind is that when we hit a climb, we actually need to keep that effort constant to what we were doing on the flat. So it'll feel like you're going a little bit easier on the climbs than you would if you were just riding your own pace. And then on the descents, it's really challenging to keep that power on. So just train yourself to keep the power on the pedals on the descents and try and keep that intensity consistent across the effort. And then finally, circuits. So this is something that we can do wherever we live. If you've got a little group of mountain bike trails, a little circuit, linking up some roads, and this is just an activity for everyone to kind of create a little bit of a session that you can tweak depending on what you're trying to train for. So this really came to mind recently when some friends of mine in Australia were under a COVID lockdown, and they could only go 5 kilometers from their house, and they had to figure out a little circuit near home where they could do some training. So one of the things that's really useful is that you can find a little circuit that's quiet, that's safe, perhaps with a mix of terrain, so maybe some climbing, maybe some technical sections, and then you can, just using a simple stopwatch, you can try and ride laps at a consistent pace. If you were trying to train for a longer event, you want to make sure that you can keep that pace up for multiple laps in a row, even as you start to fatigue. Or you can emphasize a particular element of the lap, so perhaps the climb or perhaps the technical section, depending on what your focus is. So those are just a couple of little sessions for everyone to think about, and obviously there's a lot of flexibility in there. The events are so diverse, and we're a bunch of people that have got a lot of different amounts of time to train. Some of us just want to ride our bike as well, but some of those sessions should be useful for all of you, and I hope that there's some useful take-home messages in this presentation for you. So moving on, we've now got time to answer some questions. So if anyone's got any questions, please pop them in the chat, or even if you don't think of the question today, feel free to send me a message via the LGCC WhatsApp group. Agris is going to pop the presentation up on YouTube as well if people would like to refer back to it later on. I just saw your question there, Andrew. So yep, that'll be up on YouTube pretty soon. We're definitely recording it. Let me just take a moment to have a look at the questions there, and then I will start to give you guys some answers. Okay. Great, questions are coming in thick and fast. Thank you, everyone. Okay. So first one I've got here, the question is, how much more difficult is it to cycle on gravel with knobbly tyres than on a gravel bike? So this question, I think really, because the terrain that you might be riding on, in a gravel race is so diverse, as we mentioned, there might actually be times or particular cases where the mountain bike tires, the knobbly tires, are actually the better choice. So I think that to the questioner there, I think that choosing the particular tires that suit the terrain that you're going to be covering, or making the best choice that you can based on what you know about the particular course, is going to help. In sort of absolute terms, the knobbier tires are generally going to have a higher rolling resistance and therefore require more effort to keep rolling. But the difference is not going to be massive. I think most people have tried riding a mountain bike on the road, and it feels quite slow when you're riding those knobbly tires on a smooth surface. I think riding knobbly tires in a gravel race is absolutely fine, and in some cases that can give you an advantage when the terrain is quite technical, as we saw in one of the photos on a previous slide. Hopefully that helps. Next question there. So, okay. Is it true that gravel riding is typically 1.5 times harder effort than road? So I think to the questioner there, so we're sort of talking about intensity and effort. That's how I'm interpreting your 1.5 times harder point there. So typically the resistance that you encounter when riding on soft terrain with bigger tires is going to be higher, and therefore your bike speed will actually be a little bit lower than, say, road riding. However, we as athletes have a certain capacity to put out energy, to put out power, and that doesn't change between disciplines. So it's not, in this case, it's not true that it's 1.5 times harder, but there would be an increase in the resistance that you are battling against when riding on gravel terrain versus on smooth tarmac. So that's the main difference there. Our sort of ability to perform is no different. To give you an example that's relevant at the moment, if they ran the 100 meter sprint in the athletics, if they ran that on a carpet or like a soft soft ground, the times would be slower. But if all the sprinters were giving their maximum effort, they wouldn't actually, their performance in terms of what they're capable of would not necessarily be any different, just the finishing times, and that's down to the resistance that they face based on the terrain. Hopefully that helps. Next question. How should I train for a multi-day race compared to a single day race? So that one's particularly important when you're talking about backing up day after day, and recovery is the key thing there. And so there's a couple of points that I would make in terms of preparing for a multi-day race. The first one is that when you are in the lead up to that multi-day race, you need to make sure that you take some easy days. There's a term we use called tapering. So that's where you reduce the amount of riding that you're doing over a few days or a week or 10 days up to the event. And when the events are, a couple of days or a week as compared to one day, you do need to have a little bit of a break going into the race to allow you to have a bit of freshness, so that you're not accumulating a large amount of fatigue day after day and then putting yourself in a big hole at the end of the race. So that would be the main one. The second point is the things that you can do during the event. So as soon as one stage finishes, you have a window of, it might be sort of 12 hours, it might be 18 hours between the finish of one and the start of the next leg. What you do with that time is very important. So making sure that you're refueling, rehydrating, and doing essentially as little as possible, and trying to restore your energy resources, so that you're able to perform as best you can the following day. Okay. I got loads of questions. Next one. Any specific advice on clothing for a race and tools/spares to have with you? So I think it really comes back to the event and the likely conditions that you'll be faced with. So I think first and foremost, I think everyone needs to dress in a way that they're safe should the conditions take a turn for the worse. So whether that means taking a raincoat, some arm warmers. I know the weather in this country is quite unpredictable, so I would certainly keep that in mind as the primary concern for clothing. Secondly, tools and spares. Just reflecting back on that self-sufficiency comment before. So I think everyone can make their own decision as to what is essential and what is optional as far as tools and spares, but the common problems that you see in gravel races are typically punctures or tire issues. Then the next one would probably be broken chains. So having some sort of tube or pump or a latex inflation cartridge to repair your punctured tire, or a hole in your tubeless tire if you're running tubeless. That's essential for sure. And then next of all, having some sort of a multi-tool is really handy, where you can repair a broken chain or tighten up a loose bolt or something like that. Anything on top of that, depends on how far away from technical help you're going, I think, and what the sort of environment is like in terms of support from the race organisers or from other athletes. Okay, next question. With limited time to train, is it better to do longer endurance efforts or to do more shorter and intense rides with intervals? So with limited time to train, I think that's a common struggle that we all have. Watching the Olympics over the last couple of weeks, as I'm sure some of you also have been, sometimes you go, imagine if I had 30 hours a week to train, I could totally do that. And we think, it's just because I only have 4 hours or 8 hours a week to train. So what we do with those hours that's a great question. And what we do with those hours is really important. I think I'd come back to the specificity point. So we need to tailor our training towards the event that we're doing. And the second point would be trying to arrange the training. So the number of sessions, there might be some flexibility in the number of sessions that you can have per week. So if you had 5 hours to train per week, let's say, you could do 5 1-hour sessions, or you could do a 3-hour ride on a Sunday and 2 1-hour sessions during the week. That's where there's some flexibility. And I think actually those short sessions can be really valuable if we make the most out of them by doing some of those more intense interval sessions in the short sessions. and then using some of that available time and doing a longer ride, perhaps on the weekend, to build our endurance. So a balance between some of the shorter, more intense sessions, and then also using that time to make sure we're working on our, or at least maintaining our endurance as well. Okay, next question here. This is a good one for a Friday night. Best recovery strategy, hazy IPA or Southern German Pilsner? I'm going to go for option C, chocolate milk. Great question, but funny enough, so there is actually a nutrition company called Sport Beer that's putting out beer that is specifically sort of formulated in terms of the nutrient content to help with recovery from sport. So I check out Sport Beer. I'm not endorsed by them in any way, but hopefully that's a suitable recovery strategy for you if it needs to involve beer. Next question. So what percentage of terrain should you split between off and on road? Does this depend on your skill set and prior experience? So the answer, as every scientist will say, is it depends. And the things that it depends on are your background, but also on the types of sessions, the terrain that you have available. To give you a couple of examples, so training for off-road events, the professional cross-country races, they don't necessarily do all their training off-road, which you might expect as professional athletes. They probably spend, it might be 50-50, it might be 60-40, and flip either way depending on the time of year. But one of the things with off-road riding, and I'll include gravel in that, is that there is a high sort of mechanical load. So there's a lot of bumps and vibrations coming through the bikes, which, aside from the effort that we're putting into the pedaling, those that mechanical load through our muscles and through our body actually causes quite a lot of fatigue. So what happens if we tend to do a higher number of off-road workouts, or if they're spaced more closely together, we can accumulate a lot of soreness and load through the joints and connective tissues in the body. And if you're not used to that, that can be, you can find yourself quite sore and having to take a couple of days off the bike. So I think it's important to spread those different disciplines out. I would say that if you're training for a gravel race and you also do some road riding, let's say, you probably want to be on the gravel bike, ideally a couple of times a week. And then, let's say you're doing 4 sessions, you might do 2 on the road bike, 2 on the gravel bike, but really use that time, as we spoke about with the previous question, to add some specificity. So be particular with your training. So if you're training for a 3-hour gravel race, you probably want to use that longer ride slot that you have on the weekend to ride your gravel bike and do something that's going to benefit your race performance as much as possible. Great questions. I've probably got time for 2 more. All right. So next question. During a gravel ride, I usually aim for 70 to 90 RPM, same as on the road. Is that correct? So we spoke a little bit about cadence and torque and off-road riding during the presentation, and I mentioned that when we're riding off-road, when there's softer ground and higher rolling resistance as a result, our cadence is typically a little bit lower. I think that range is quite healthy. I think at the extreme end is, so outside of a range, if you're finding yourself pedaling slower than say 60 RPM regularly on a ride, due to the steepness of the hills that you're encountering, or perhaps the gearing on your bike is meaning that you have to pedal a very slow cadence, then we can adjust our gearing to enable us to ride at a little bit of a more sustainable cadence. So I think that the 70 to 90 range that you've given is great, and that's quite suitable. Typically on the road bike, when we're carrying a lot higher speed and the resistance is a little bit different, mostly due to the air rather than the ground that we're riding over. It's a bit easier to maintain a little bit of a higher cadence, but that range is absolutely fine. The sessions that I suggested, pedaling slower, so that the torque sessions are a particular training sort of stimulus or method, if you like. To basically what we're doing there is we're contracting our muscles over a longer period of time by pedaling slower, and that will help in those sort of steep climbs, high torque situations. So I'm not suggesting that the 60 RPM climb efforts are something that you should do in your race. You should definitely stick to a range as you've suggested there, that's comfortable and sustainable. So that's absolutely fine. All right, last question. Apologies for not getting to everyone. Feel free to send them through to me later on. I'll get back to you as best I can. So final question we've got here. I measure my heart rate and speed. What's the minimum data I can get away with but still see gains? So first of all, great that you're measuring your data. I think that's being mindful, being aware of what we're doing essentially. So heart rate is one way of getting some feedback on the sort of effort that we're making. I think heart rate in conjunction with rating of perceived exertion, so the RPE scale that we spoke about earlier, can be really useful tools to monitor your intensity. In terms of the data that you need to see improvements, I don't necessarily think the data limits you at all, but it will help inform you as to how to get the most out of your sessions. So as we mentioned before, if instead of riding at a steady pace, as you just would if you went out for a bike ride for an hour, if you tweaked that session slightly to then do some specific efforts. So for example, the hill repeats that we spoke about, if you included those in that 1 hour ride, then chances are you would see some performance benefits for those type of efforts versus just going out for a 1 hour ride without any structure. But I'll come back to the word specificity there, which is really important. So what you do within that training session is really what matters most. And you've got some great tools there to start measuring that and adjusting your training to see the benefits from it. And using simple things like timing yourself on a climb. Strava is a popular tool for similar things like that. We can get an idea of how our performance is changing. So great question. Again, thanks everyone for all the questions. I've got so many here. It's been excellent to see. I really hope that everyone's enjoyed the presentation and can take something that they've learned away from today and apply it perhaps in their training for a gravel race or just on their ride at the weekend. So that's all from me. Thanks everyone for joining, and I look forward to seeing you out there on the trails in the future.
Thanks very much.
No worries. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.